So carry on with this idea of tax and who pays them. We have the current equilibrium at $2.60 and say 30 million liters of milk. So it's the market for milk that we've seen before. And now we imagine that the government imposes a farm gate tax, an excise tax of 30 cents per liter on producers, dairy farmers. So we've got the 30-cent tax now placed in between as a wedge between the demand and supply curve. Notice we put it on the left-hand side of the equilibrium. So the $2.80 now is the price paid by consumers, and $2.50 is what is received by the dairy farmers. This is compared to the price in equilibrium without a tax of $2.60. So now we can say, in effect, that the consumers see an increase of the price by 20 cents from what they paid before, and the producers receive 10 cents less. So the point here is that while the tax is applied to dairy producers and they have to pay the money to the government for every liter that leaves their farm, in fact, of the 30-cent tax, they only, in effect, lose 10 cents, whereas the consumers lose 20 cents. And this distinction is important. It leads to a concept of legal incidence versus economic incidence. The legal incidence refers to who is legally required to pay the tax to the government. So in this case, it would be the legal incidence. It falls on the dairy farmers. The economic incidence, though, is quite different. It refers to who, in effect, sees a change in the price in the absence compared to the situation without the tax, or who bears the burden of the tax. And this is going to depend on the shape of the supply and demand curve. It's a very important result that actually has only become very clear. It's been known to economists for the last, maybe 100 years or so, but it's becoming increasingly understood by politicians or people in the policymakers. And in fact, the legal terminology is still used often. They sometimes refer to a direct tax and an indirect tax. Our Constitution in Canada was written, 1867 originally. It has this kind of reference to it, which is misguided. If in the legal term, a direct tax is one in which presumably the person who is assessed pays the tax. The indirect tax legally is the idea that you can pass the tax on to somebody else. But this really has no meaning to it. There's a branch of, we've talked about this earlier, called law and economics, in which lawyers kind of look at economic theory to see what the consequences of a legal decision would be. And at the same time, economists look at the law to try and understand why we do certain things the way we do them. And here's an instance where the law may be written one way, but the economic effect of something is quite different than what is intended. Let's take a look at some examples here. In the Montreal, for example, the city, there's a property tax. If you own property in Montreal, you have to pay an annual tax based on the value of the property to the city. The legal incidence falls on the landowner. So, for example, if you're living in an apartment, you're a tenant. Legally, you don't pay the tax, but you probably do. The economic incidence is something quite different. It's going to be rather complex to decide whether it's truly the landowner or the tenant. The tenant would pay for the tax in part through a higher rent. Another example, of course, is the Gst and Pst that we know. The legal incidence, it falls on the store owner. They're the one that has to collect the tax and pay it to the government. But in actual fact, it may well be the customer. It depends on the good, depends on the circumstance. The people that buy the product may bear the burden, but could also be the store owner, the seller of the item. A more controversial one is corporate tax. Corporations in Canada have to pay taxes. In a sense, it's impossible for a corporation to pay the tax. It's going to be either the customers of the company, the shareholders, or the owners of the company, and then finally the employees. One of those three groups, in effect, will bear the burden of the tax. It's not clear who, unless you do an analysis of the supply and demand for each of these markets. And yet, governments frequently apply corporate tax when people imagine somehow that an unnamed person, a corporation, is going to be paying this tax. I want to look at this idea of economic incidence a little bit further, and particularly bring in the notion of inefficiency and wastefulness and see what that really means. So we've got the supply and demand curve as before. And we've got the equilibrium price before the tax, $2.60. And now I'm going to put in 4 people on each of the curves. Now you notice A and B, they're on the demand curve. So these are buyers. These would be people that would be willing to buy milk at the price of equilibrium price of $2.60 before the tax. Person A, for example, would be willing to pay more, but they only have to pay the market price. C and D, on the other hand, these are dairy farmers. They bring their milk to Montreal and sell it. And D would be somebody that would be willing to bring it at a much lower price. Fine. Now, let's impose a tax. We have this 30-cent tax now, which leads to a price for consumers and another price for producers, which is the difference, the 30 cents. So it's the same as what we've seen before. But notice something here that's relevant. Person A and person B, before they were purchasing milk, what happens now? Well, as a result of this new tax, person B, in effect, will stop buying milk. They're only prepared to pay maybe $2.70 for milk. Now that the consumer price has risen to $2.80, they stop buying. Another way to view it too is person A is the consumer or the buyer who actually pays the tax, in the sense that they're the one who previously paid $2.60, now they pay $2.80. The government collects the 20 cents from this person. Do the same thing for the sellers. Person C is somebody that decides to go elsewhere with their milk. They go to another place. They stop selling milk in the market because they'd only be receiving $2.50, whereas they'd got $2.60 before. Person D, so person A pays through a higher price, and person D, in effect, pays the tax through accepting a lower selling price. These two groups here, this group per person B, let's say, and this person C, this is a lose-lose situation, and this is the source of the waste. The government doesn't collect any money from these people because they don't pay the tax. They don't buy the product. They don't buy milk. And at the same time, these people lose because they don't get milk, whereas before they did. And it is this wastefulness, this lose-lose, that causes economists to say that they don't like taxes. Sometimes they say taxes is the power to destroy or to stop something. And in fact, this is what we're seeing here. Now, the point here is that governments require taxes. They need tax revenue. So then it becomes a question of, is there some way to design a tax system such that the number of people like B and C are minimized? The lose-lose or the waste is limited, so there's less of it. And this would be an ideal tax system. And economists have advised politicians about ways to do. There are ways of doing this. The problem, in part, is the tax system is very political. And so politicians are leery of getting involved in making any change in tax policy. It's difficult to do, relatively rare. And when it happens, politicians often destroy their reputation. I want to take a look at another case, different shape of the curve, just to give a sense of this. In a more advanced course in microeconomics, then you'd see this kind of thing more clearly. But let's consider a situation of, say, an island in the Caribbean, and they've got hotel rooms, and we've got an equilibrium, like before, without tax. Where you'll notice something, the consumer pays the price, the producer, hotel owners receive the same amount of money, so there's no tax. And you see the number of hotel rooms that are rented. Government comes along and decides that it wants to impose a tax for revenue, but the plan is to impose it on people staying at a hotel. Presumably these are foreigners. So the thinking a little bit would be that, hey, we're going to impose this tax on foreigners, the local people won't have to pay it, and it'll be a good source of revenue for the government. And politically it's sellable, it's acceptable. So what would happen as a result? Well, here we've got a new tax. I haven't put the exact values in the numbers, but we get the sense of it. We drive a wedge between the demand and supply curve as before. And then you'll notice something quite relevant here, is that the change for the consumer is relatively small, whereas the change for the seller is relatively large. So in effect, the legal incidence appears that the tax is being applied to foreigners, where in actual fact, the economic incidence, the tax falls largely on the hotels. And in this case, it's not clear. It could be the hotel owners, or it could be the employees working in the hotel sector, but it's going to be somebody on the supply side. And this is just due to the shape of the supply and demand curve. You'll notice something here. The demand curve is relatively flat, and that refers to a concept in economics called price sensitive. And it's likely the case for tourists going to a sun destination that they're price sensitive. They can go to a different island. If they find that the hotel rooms are cheaper elsewhere, they'll just change where they're going to go. And that's what this demand curve, the shape of it, what it shows. Whereas, of course, if you own a hotel on an island, it's kind of difficult to move to a different island. You have to pick the hotel, but that's not possible. But as I say, if you're curious about this kind of thing, you would see a better analysis in an advanced course in microeconomics. I want to finish with just a final point about this idea about TFSA and the RSP. In economic terms, these two methods of saving are identical. They accomplish the same thing. And in fact, the purpose of them is to lead to efficiency in the tax system. And it's a rather surprise. TFSA has only existed in Canada now since about 2010. The RSP dates from the 1980s, and it's kind of surprising that these are so recent. They should have been added to the tax system much more for far longer, because as they say, they correct for a distortion. And in that sense, the difference incidentally between them is that in the case of the TFSA, you pay the tax at the current tax rate, whereas in the RSP you pay the tax later, post-pay the tax, but at a future tax rate. This TFSA is particularly interesting for students because it's likely as that your tax rate is extremely low or possibly even zero right now. So the student would be interested, if they have any savings at all, to put them into a TFSA, because when you take the money out later, presumably you'll have a higher tax rate, but you won't have to pay that tax rate, because it's incorrect to say that these are really tax avoidance measures. What they do is they correct for a distortion. The distortion arises between saving and consumption. Again, though, to look at this in detail would require a more advanced course.